we're very happy to have at this seminar 3 papers that all address different kinds of interventions currently being made into children's mobility by different actors and in different parts of the world. And we're hoping that that will open up some questions that can be usefully discussed about how and why the lines are drawn between legitimate, benign forms of movement and illegitimate, harmful forms of movement. So what we're going to do is to have half an hour with each of our presenters, first of all, allowing them to speak, and then following on with a quick Q&A related to their paper first. And then we should have almost half an hour left for Afua, Chomdanso, Imo, and I to make a short intervention and then have a more general discussion. So I'm going to pass straight over to Dr. Michael Boampong, who's a lecturer in childhood and youth studies at the Open University, and whose research focuses on the ways in which the global and the local intersect and impact on transnational childhoods and youth transition. And today he's going to speak about his ethnographic research on transnational children and parents in Ghana and the UK. And I'm very excited to hear this paper, and it's great that you've agreed to speak to us. So thank you, Michael.
Sorry, Julia. Michael, before you start, can I just say that we are recording, but we will stop the recording before the general discussion. So do bear in mind that when we're having the individual Q&As over each paper, we'll still be recording at that time, but we'll stop it before the general discussion in the last half hour or so. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, perfect. So thank you very much. I'm going to speak about an ethnographic research that I did since 2014 in the aftermath of the global economic crisis to understand how economic crisis impacts on social reproduction processes. And by this, I'm also going to argue that young people's mobility is an important aspect of the sustenance and also reproduction of transnational families. So I'm going to use these concepts, transnational social fields, which is a concept that has been deployed to understand the relationship between people who move and those who stay behind. But then once people move, they don't sever their relationship with those who are left behind. So there is often some form of material exchange or regular engagement to sustain how they live their family lives. Also, with respect to social reproduction, which is a concept that has been theorized to understand how families reproduce themselves. And this would be one of the ways in which I would also want to emphasize some of the transnational practices and how parents see those practices as a way of reproducing a good child. At the same time, also not just limiting myself to the vulnerabilities that we construct migrants to be in, but then also the forms of practices that parents adopt are things that can be conceptualized as an agential practice to overcoming some of the challenges that they face as migrants. So just to give a little bit of a context, and this is something that I would conceptualize as an uneven transnational social field and development that most migrants find themselves. So in Ghana was one of the sites that I did my data collection, and in Ghana, due to inequalities and poverty, migration is one of the main survival strategies that most of the migrant parents that I interviewed, they embarked on migration to overcome poverty and also to help sustain family life back home with generations that they were supposed to look after. But then at the same time, also when we look into historical development process, we realize that structural adjustment programs and also some of the effects that it had in terms of redeployment and unemployment. And in today's development era with neoliberal development, that is also one of the development interventions that is also trying to promote this middle class lifestyle with the agenda of lifting people out of poverty, but then also increases the cost of living, which people still have to maintain their everyday life by trying to do different things, including embarking on migration or maintaining their relationship with people who have moved overseas. At the same time, also when I was doing this study, that was also with the aftermath of the global economic crisis. And here in the UK, as we would all agree to, there was a lot of fiscal austerity measures, which has direct implications on, the cost of living and also how families would want to live their everyday life or how they maintain their everyday life with respect to cost of food, housing, and other things that matter in everyday life. And for most of the families that I interviewed, for the transnational families and particularly with the migrant parents here who have their children here, they were caught in between the position of having to procure care from the markets, in the sense of the way in which commodified care is becoming a norm within the British society, and having to also relate with their own upbringing when they were raised in Ghana and not having to be, cared for in the sense of, they being cared for by other people in the sense of purchasing care for them to be able to be cared for. So social parenting, as we all know, was something that is very much common in most developing countries. And that was what most of the parents of these children that I interviewed were used to. So they were caught within the position of having to procure care from the market, or having to adopt social parenting, which they preferred social parenting at a younger stage or at the early years of the children. At the same time, also with respect to low educational and career attainment among Black people, which is a very common thing amongst most Ghanaian families, they read about it, they also talk about it in their everyday lives. So some of these things also shape the way in which they think about their children's present life and also their future, as to whether they are able to get a better education here in the UK, or also being able to progress up the career ladder in a context where Black people, as a matter of fact, are racialized and not able to get the kind of support that they need. So with respect to the methodology of this research, I carried out a multi-sited ethnographic research. The primary area where I did my research was here in the UK, with most of the participants of the interviews being here in London. And then I took a simultaneous sample match approach of tracing the relations of the people I interviewed here back to Ghana to also understand their own form of perspective and experience having to live in Ghana. So for parents who were here, some of them were able to connect me to their children and also the caregivers back in Ghana for me to understand their everyday life and also their own perspective of having to live transnational lives in Ghana. And I interviewed 95 people, 33 of them being children and also 22 young people and also adults being a mix of those who were caregivers and also parents here in the UK, the biological parents of these children that I interviewed. And also for most of the families that I interviewed, most of them classify themselves based on different attributes of their economic life as being working class families, having to do low paid jobs, some of them in cleaning, and also sometimes in the healthcare service, but then at the lower bottom of the hierarchy. And with respect to their children, these were some of them were children who were moving in between London and also Ghana. But then at the same time, there were some children whom I would describe as, being in the state of migrancy. There were people who were waiting and hoping to join their parents in Ghana after they were sent to Ghana. But then later on, they were caught up with the financialization of family reunification, where parents needed to demonstrate about £18,000 before they can bring in their dependent child, because these children didn't have British citizenship as of the time that they were sent to Ghana. So they were trapped, as a matter of fact, in Ghana, and their parents having to go through the process of bringing them back here was going to be constrained by their own economic position here in the UK, and also the fact that they didn't have time to be able to cope with childcare and also achieve their economic goals. So I deploy qualitative methods, mainly repeated semi-structured interviews, and also observations and group discussions, as well as visual methods for the data collection. So with this slide, I would like to focus on reproduction of what it means to be a good Ghanaian child. And that was one of the common themes that came up in my interactions with the families that I interviewed here and also in Ghana. So for most parents, they would want to raise a good Ghanaian child. And the characteristics of this good Ghanaian child is mainly a child who is studious, that devotes much attention to his or her studies, and also a child who is respectful. For parents, having grown in a culture of respect where they would have to greet elderly people with some form of respect, respond quickly to call from an adult. These were things that they considered as much respectful and wanted it to also be embodied within their own children. Also being resilient, the sense of resilience was something that was considered very good in raising a good child, because for most of these adults, they felt that the environment that they found themselves here in the UK was a very tough environment where they wanted their children to also grow with some skill set that would help them to be able to survive the various forms of risks that comes with being a migrant in the UK. Also being disciplined and also having to have some form of language competence with respect to the local languages that the parents spoke at home. And also, as we all know, there have been some studies that have been done in most developing countries with migrant families that have proven the importance of extended family relations and foster parents in the involvement of social development of children who are sent to their parents' origin countries or those who are left behind. So that sense of abandonment that characterizes some transnational migration studies is something that is usually unfounded because of the role of the extended family in raising children who are left behind by migrant parents. So I'm going to reflect on some of the key trends that I observed with respect to the movement of children between the UK-Ghana transnational social field. And one of the key migration phenomena that I observed was this trend of reverse migration. As we all know, most of the ways in which we think about migration has often been about a unidirectional movement of people moving from a developing country to a developed country. But then this was the case where for most parents, due to political economic conditions which were constraining, they felt they needed to take a backward movement for their children. Some children had been brought here to the UK, but then they had to go back to Ghana for a temporary period of time. So in terms of practices of parenting, so the key characteristic of the parenting strategies of some of these parents were seen within the context of the children having to experience hardship and also being disciplined. So here are some quotes that I have of one child, Florence, who is the mother of Efua in particular. Efua is 7 years, I was 7 years as at the time that I interviewed her. And here, Florence being the mother, makes a point about the fact that for most of the children who are born here, and she was also referring to her own child as children who grow up, not being appreciative and also not demonstrating respect to elderly people. But then she would want her own child and also other children who are born here in the UK to experience that form of toughness and also being able to go through life with that hard life that is able to push them to do things for themselves. She also talks about the fact that sometimes she has to go the extra mile of pushing her own child to do things which normally she would have expected a child to do for herself. So here we realize that a parent taking the interest in making sure that her own child becomes appreciative and also is respectful. So it's one of the ways in which the parents felt that they needed to raise their children to be able to respect and also appreciate things in a very tough environment. With the UK being a tough environment, they felt that they would be able to do this at a younger age, which would then help their children once they grow up in a tough environment to be able to cope. But then when I went to Ghana, I met a fierce grandmother who took care of her, and she also had the same understanding about what it means to raise a good child. So she also talked about being a disciplinarian, having to beat a fear when she does something wrong. And at the same time, one of the interesting things I observed here was the fact that though this grandmother was not in the UK, she was very much aware of the challenges that most migrants go through with limited time to provide care for people's own children. So she talked about also they do not have much time to take care of the child. So this is something that in essence, both people in destination countries and also at origin countries sometimes share in the sense of having a disciplined child and a good child, and we would want to come together to raise that good child at the end of the day. And then I had the opportunity of interacting with Efia after she had returned from Ghana to the UK. But then what I observed was that in most cases, when these children go back to their parents' native origin country, they might not be completely aware of the reasons why they go to the sending country. But then at the same time, there is not that sense of abandonment because of transnational practices which have been enhanced by technology. For instance, Efia was regularly in touch with her mother for her mother to understand her everyday life, and often they would talk about her education experience and also life at home in Ghana. So there wasn't that sense of neglect or abandonment that often comes up in some research. So that's one thing that we have to understand in terms of the transnational connections and arrangements that are in place to continue to sustain family life, even when people are separated physically. Also, the other key thing that characterized raising a good child was also with respect to how young people themselves, relatively older children, often contested ideas of hardship and discipline, which their parents were advancing in their lives. So I met Emmanuel, for instance, who talked about the fact that though he lived in Ghana and had a sense of freedom being in Ghana and not constrained by neighborhood restrictions that often permeates our society here in the UK. So she felt she had more freedom to move around in Ghana without being constrained. But there was also that sense of the challenge that he faced with respect to everyday life, having to wake up very early in the morning to work, which was a very key aspect of the reason why his father and mother sent him to Ghana. But then also with respect to his own everyday life, he felt that his life and how he was able to take control of his life, he felt powerless by the position that he found himself having to have routine things to do from morning till evening. So that was also one of the things that came through with respect to the connection between power and then freedom, young people feeling less in control of their lives, but then also feeling a sense of freedom in terms of their own mobility in Ghana. And also, one of the ways in which young people challenged or contested the ideas of hardship and discipline, which I spoke earlier on about, was with respect to the goods that they consumed or part of their everyday life, what it means, what they had to eat, for instance, and how they communicated that over transnational practices of communication and speaking with their parents about their everyday lives. So Emmanuel, for instance, when he would speak with his mother, would complain about the food that he was eating. And that, of course, meant that what the parents thought about in terms of keeping their child in Ghana wasn't something that they were going to be entirely free of, but then they still had to continue to maintain that sense of care and also showing interest in not just having to keep the child in a hard condition, but then also making the life of the child better. So again, in this sense, somehow contradicting what the parents were expecting to achieve in Ghana by helping the child to go through a hard life, but then at the end of the day, finding ways and means to also mitigate the hardship that their children were going through with the kind of food that they had at school or at home. So by this also, there was a more reinforcement of transnational practices by the fact that the child was in Ghana and having to demand more things from the UK. And another way in which the young people challenged the ideas of hardship and discipline was mainly with respect to sometimes when the caregivers in Ghana asked them to do something as part of the disciplinary measures, these children would resist, as was in the case of what I was told by Emmanuel's grandmother, that he was told to kneel down, but then he disrespected. And later on, the grandmother felt that some other children in the household were copying this character. But then interestingly, what I observed here was also the fact that the peers of these children also, in one way or the other, also show interest in adopting attitudes of British Ghanaian children who may not want to respect or carry on certain character traits as per what adults would instruct them. So there was also that interest by other peers, so following what British Ghanaian children were doing in Ghana, which some parents also, or grandparents in this sense, did not want to encourage. So in this slide, I would also want to make the emphasis that the practice of reverse migration is also a strategy that comes about as a result of the crisis of care, and also eventually also in one way or the other, a way in which families would want to cope with economic crisis and also receive reverse remittances that comes about once families are engaged in some form of transnational arrangements. So as I said earlier on, when you look at a political economic condition that most parents or families, transnational families, particularly migrants in the destination country, being the UK, found themselves, some of them were trapped in precarious job conditions of not having a good paying job, and at the same time also thinking about aspirations of bringing their children here, which were being not coming into the day to see the day of the light of day due to the financialization of family reunification. So in this case, for instance, Mercy's mother, thinking about the £18,000 requirement that is needed for her to be able to bring Mercy here. Just to bring you back to all of us to the context of Mercy's situation. So Mercy was born here in the UK, but then was sent to Ghana for care arrangements when her parents were also undocumented here in the UK. But then later on, when I went to Ghana, after interviewing Mercy's parents here in the UK, I went to Ghana and I met Mercy, and then she also talked about the poor quality of education that she was receiving in Ghana, and her expectations and aspirations to reunify with her parents here in the UK. But then what is also important here is that the poor state of education is also reflective of the colonial history of Ghana, where missionaries who went to Ghana during the colonial ages established an educational system that was supposed to produce modern day civilized subjects. So what Mercy was experiencing was also part of the implications of colonialism and how the country has also inherited a legacy of colonialism that is impacting on generations of young people. So that's also one of the things that we have to bear in mind when talking about children who are involved in transnational movements and some of the things that they experience. The situation of Mercy in this context was also something that was different because in most cases, when you look at the migration research, you realize that even for working class families, in most destination countries, once they move their children to origin countries, they are able to afford it.
Sorry to interrupt, Michael, you've got 5 minutes.
You are able to have a better education once you are in the developing country. But then it wasn't the case of Mercy because her parents were also constantly involved in a precarious job condition. But then later on, when I interacted with Mercy's elder sister, and also again taking on the interest of understanding intragenerational experiences among transnational families, her elder sister told me about how Mercy has been involved in also selling secondhand goods that are being sent by their father. And later on, they send the proceeds or the profits of the goods that are sold in Ghana to the UK for the parents to be able to also cope with the cost of living here in the UK. So here also we realize the fact that children are not just passive once they are sent to the origin country, but that somehow they are also involved in economic gains and also reproduction in terms of the economic benefits that they bring if they are involved in transnational arrangements. So here what I would want to conclude on is that the involvement of parents in reverse migration strategies is part of a coping strategy that they employ when they are faced with economic constraints in the developed country, being here in the UK, where most of the parents found themselves living in precarious conditions. So it's in direct response to the political economic condition that they find themselves. But then the form of practice that these parents take is also in relation to what they think about the present condition of their child, and also with respect to the future, which they think that their children may continually be subject to, would experience risks and challenges of being a migrant. So they would want to raise a risk-bearing subject and a resilient subject to be able to cope with economic conditions that most migrants experience in the host country. But then we realized that from what I have presented so far, that children don't just embrace these practices of raising a good child, what goes into a good child, and the different characteristics that is embedded in this. So there are some forms of resistance to certain practices, as I mentioned earlier. So children are not passive in the mobility and also what forms of practices that are involved in raising them up at the different parts of the transnational social field. And one of the things that I found very much interesting, and which would be interesting to look further into, has to do with how children are able to cultivate new networks once they move from one place to the other. For instance, those who move to Ghana are able to have new friends, and over time they are able to sustain their relationship with these people, even when they return back to the UK through, for instance, calls and understanding everyday lives of people. But then also, can we think about these practices that parents adopt? Can we think about it as a way in which people, most migrant parents are reworking motherhood and what it means to care for their own children? Do we, are they contesting or challenging what it means to get care? Is care something that should be procured on the market, or is it something that should be done personally? Which I think, in the context of my research, most of the parents that I engaged or interviewed were resisting these forms of marketization and commodification of care. And moving forward, it will be also interesting to understand how, for instance, the language competence that children develop, and also the relationships that they develop in terms of social networks and cultural capital. How useful is this along their life course? Is it something that they can later on leverage on once they grow up and they have to negotiate different economic environments? So for instance, if they are facing unemployment here in the UK, does the language competence that they've been able to develop from childhood be in a local language? Is this useful once, for instance, they return to Ghana and they would want to establish a social enterprise and having to know the inner workings of another society? So I would end here. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and I'm sure if we could do a round of applause, we would. But actually, that's now taken up the 30 minutes allotted. So maybe I could ask people to save their questions for Michael for afterwards, so that we can move in line with the programme straight on to Dr. Esther Bott, who is a sociologist from the University of Nottingham and whose expertise on migration and mobilities has included a focus on tourism, with lots of very interesting research on tourism and mobility. And she's going to speak today about her ethnographic research on orphanage tourism in Nepal. So,
thank you, Julia.
Over to Esther.
Thanks, Julia. Can everybody hear me, and can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about my research on orphanage tourism in Nepal. This is ongoing research that was interrupted by COVID, and I'm hoping to return to it. So I'll just be talking about a pilot study that I did in 2018, and then this continuation of that kind of pilot study, really, so I went back to Nepal. So far I've done interviews and action research with 26 young adults who'd lived in commercial orphanages as children. So these are orphanages where tourists can pay to volunteer as part of their holiday. 20 of these participants had been rescued from commercial orphanages by third sector organisations, those sort of NGO and charity organisations. And I just, I'm getting a real feedback, so I wonder if people could turn their mic. Maybe that will help. Yeah, that seems better, thank you. So yeah, so 20 of them had been rescued by NGOs and put in care that also often involved interactions with foreign, predominantly Western volunteers. And over half of these children, the total of 26, had been returned to their families in the Ormla region, which is a remote and mountainous part of far western Nepal, from where they'd migrated mostly into Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. So what I'm trying to do really is learn about the experiences of the orphans as they were as children. So I'm interested in their entry routes into the industry and the nature of their exit from institutional care, whether that's commercial or NGO care. And on the back of these narratives that I've been collecting, I've been able to explore some of the inadequacies in the ways that orphanage tourism is being understood, and the ways that it's framed and politicised, especially I think in terms of who's blamed for its prevalence and how various Western entities position themselves as agents of rescue and eradication. So the research thinks about the popularity of voluntourism amongst Western tourists who engage in volunteering in orphanages whilst on holiday, which is being understood by some critical tourism scholars as a neo-colonial encounter that facilitates Western individualist mobility. And I'm exploring how this stands in tension with the assumed immobility of children inhabiting orphanages, who are typically constructed as victims of trafficking and victims of modern slavery. But actually what the research is showing, the data so far is showing that when orphanage residents themselves are consulted, their stories and their experiences are much less straightforward. And then when you look at their experiences in the context of Nepal's socioeconomic and geopolitical landscape, and thinking like Michael about, you know, the impacts of structural adjustment programs and international development, and also third sector interventions, the impacts of tourism quite critically, a much more complete picture, I think, of orphanage tourism can be revealed. So just a bit of background then to voluntourism and how sort of critical tourism is starting to understand it. So volunteering abroad, usually in countries that are less economically developed than their own, has appealed to tourists for a long time, for decades. But it's being argued that the internet and social media revolution of the early part of this century has really facilitated an explosion in international volunteering. And of course, social media platforms mean that personal volunteering experiences can be showcased and shared in what Hogan's called the era of widespread online curations of the self. It's never been easier or more convenient to search online for volunteering placements, and you can really literally just shop around through, you know, reams and reams of opportunities that are advertised online, opportunities for all kinds of volunteering in schools, animal sanctuaries, environmental projects, all really popular in many developing contexts. Including in Uganda, Cambodia and Nepal in particular, have become renowned orphanage tourism destinations. So this is where foreign tourists pay to engage in activities related to the upkeep and the support of orphanages. So helping with teaching activities, the day-to-day running of the orphanage, helping at meal times, bedtimes, and so on. Orphanage tourists are defined by Punax and Feet as tourists who wish to include an element of social work oriented volunteering in their vacation or travels, and who choose to do this by volunteering their time, sometimes coupled with financial or material support, to an orphanage. Now, since most commercial orphanages offer very short-term volunteering placements, so which can, literally can volunteer in an orphanage just for a morning, most orphanage tourism involves what Callahan and Thomas term shallow volunteering. So this is characterized by short duration, minimal skills, self-interest motives, and often career and an academic gain through CV enhancement. And academic studies based really on empirical research have been mostly very critical of the industry and of the ways in which children in poor countries are presented for consumption by tourists. So Tess Guinea, for example, who writes about orphanage tourism in Cambodia, is really critical of the ways that volunteering placements are sold through images of, especially vulnerable children, usually receiving love and care from international humanitarian actors, and these are mainly white Western women. And she argues that this reproduces a market for orphans. She notes that experiences involving vulnerable children amongst the most popular volunteer tourism practices, especially hug and orphan vacations, where tourists crave direct contact with children in global South countries. And of course, this level of intimacy is only possible because the volunteering happens in the global South. Because of course, this kind of shallow, under-regulated and self-gratifying volunteering in orphanages would be impossible in most tourists' own countries, while the market for volunteering with othered children in poor countries burgeons. And there are clear imperialist undertones here. And Rees maintains that orphanage tourism appeals to the rescue fantasies of the well-intentioned yet often ill-qualified Western volunteer. And when you look at how orphans are depicted in tourism literature, tourism promotional literature, so these adverts, there's often a conflation of stereotypical visions of passive, needy children and the helpless third world other. And it's really in this manner that the orphan is constructed as vulnerable, abandoned, and significantly in need of adult intervention. Rees again argues that images of vulnerability and enchantment are presented to objectify the poor orphan child and to commodify their neediness and hardship. And she states that for tourists who want to help or give back to poor and vulnerable children, opportunities in the global South are plentiful. And she says that demand is met by the many informal orphanages whose operations exploit this Western trope of the orphan, what Rees calls the quintessential child in need. And this kind of language and imagery is also commonly reproduced in campaign literature by NGOs and charities working towards ending orphanage tourism. Again, the vulnerability, the victimhood of orphan children, these are really heavily emphasized in third sector awareness campaigns and fundraising projects. And it's also very typical in anti-orphanage tourism campaigns for the blame to be put squarely on ruthless traffickers who offer poor families irresistible payments for their children, for the labour of their children. And whilst it's true, of course, that poverty is a key reason for children being displaced into orphanages, I'll explain later on through the data that I've collected so far, this is not the only reason. And then more recently, orphanage tourism has been added to what Neil Howard terms the rescue ideologies of anti-slavery policy, with its aim to eradicate all forms of modern slavery and child trafficking. And in fact, in 2018, Australia announced the passing of its own modern slavery bill, with direct reference to orphanage tourism as a priority area for action. And in this bill, the Australian government unequivocally classified orphanage tourism as a form of child trafficking, and therefore as an urgent case of modern slavery to be eradicated. And this was picked up in the third sector and in the press, and Chloe Setter, who's senior advisor on anti-trafficking and voluntourism at Lumos, which is J.K. Rowling's charity, whose mission is to end orphanage tourism. she explained Australia's legislation will help to take orphanage trafficking out of the shadows and put it in the spotlight on the global stage. We now need other countries to adopt similar measures and ensure their own anti-slavery legislation protects against this heinous type of child trafficking. And this sort of immediate conflation of orphanage tourism and trafficking is very common and is being embedded in new legislation around orphanage tourism. So Catherine Van Deur, for example, who was appointed to the Australian Government Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group in 2022, also conflates trafficking and slavery in relation to orphanage tourism. And she says that the desire of volunteers and visitors to assist orphans through orphanage tourism creates a demand for paper orphans, in turn fueling orphanage trafficking, thus making the orphanage a site of modern slavery. And orphanage tourism is also starting to get framed in some academic writing as a form of modern slavery and as a human trade, which is highly exploitative of and harmful to children and contributes to child trafficking. Yet the frameworks emerging in this paradigm are largely unclear and incomplete. And I use this quote by Joseph Cheer as a way of typifying that incompletion. And he argues that tourism is inherently labour intensive, provides ideal conditions for potential transgressions that leverage human exploitation, especially concerning labour and human rights. Accordingly, this should signal to tourism geographers that the association between modern slavery practices and tourism represents a potentially rich scene for critical tourism geographies research. And indeed, it is a rich theme because money is pouring into research on orphanage tourism, particularly in Australia. But the vast majority of this research so far fails to engage with orphanage residents themselves. And it also fails to engage with the wider context, the social and economic context of tourism labour exploitation. And I argue that it's this rich vein, so the opportunities for funding that come out of new modern slavery policy and legislation is what's making orphanage tourism so attractive to scholars like Cheer and his co-authors, who, you know, they're certainly doing okay in terms of funding and publications, you know, that really have come out of the political and popular interest in orphans. And I argue that the preoccupation with trafficking means that the slavery framing also really occludes the central role of international volunteers, who, as Wendell says, whose consumption feeds the demand for placements in orphanages. And this demand is, of course, deeply racialized and classed, and you know, very ethically problematic, as are other forms of volunteering in the volunteerism sector. And these are things that are being examined much more critically elsewhere in the critical tourism studies area. But these ways of analysing orphanage tourism critically are really getting overlooked in the policy and the popular interventions. And again, the framing is vastly oversimplified in how it constructs paper orphans as trafficking and slavery victims. And it's certainly true that in the narratives that emerge through my research so far don't suggest a straightforward experience of victimhood or trafficking. Actually, some of their accounts revealed that their childhoods were highly complex and very differentiated, and that their experiences in commercial and NGO orphanages were very mixed, very inconsistent and contradictory. Their entry routes into orphanages were varied. By no means were they all trafficked by third parties. In fact, most were taken into Kathmandu orphanages by older relatives, or even travelled there of their own volition in search of work and a more kind of exciting urban lifestyle. They talked about times of great sadness, fear, anger, distress whilst residing in orphanages and engaging with, you know, a succession of volunteering tourists. But just as often, really, they talked about receiving better schooling, regular meals, fun and games and excitement. And so these stories really show them as sort of creative and certainly capable of resistance and autonomy. And the analysis that I've been making so far of their stories critiques the notion that simply because they were children at the time of their orphanhood or their presentation as orphans, that this automatically means that they lacked agency and subjective complexity. And nor did that listening to their stories make me want to put them into neat homogeneous definitions, as suggested by the slavery discourse that classifies them all as victims in need of rescue. And as I'm sure most people here will know, a substantial body of empirical research on child labour shows that this helpless victim label isn't always adequate or accurate, and that the complexity of children's lives in many global contexts calls for them and their labour to be understood in much less victimising and reductive ways. And we also know that children who are displaced for the purposes of work are not necessarily trafficked, and the conflation of child labour and trafficking throws up many points of contradiction and contestation. And I argue that while the high-profile modern slavery framing might and does draw attention and resources to the phenomenon of orphanage tourism, unfortunately offers poor solutions to it and to the broader problems underpinning labour exploitation, and particularly in tourism in my field. And this is because I think, as Van der Geest and Marschke note in relation to the recent modern slavery framing of Thai fisheries, the anti-modern slavery movement focuses on specific forms of unfree labour rather than on bigger questions about the complexities of freedom, unfreedom, coercion and force inherent in capitalist labour relations, such as the financial compulsion to perform labour and the varying degrees of exploitation this entails. I'm just going to move on because I think it's probably my talk's a bit long. Okay, so this rise then in the popularity and the prevalence of orphanage tourism has prompted widespread vocal outcry and a strong voice of resistance and critique really emerging in the third sector. And if just a cursory internet search of all the charities and religious groups and NGOs working in the area of orphanage tourism shows that the dominant narrative here again centres on severe child exploitation, with many references to abuse, exploitation, and the children's urgent need of rescue. And the tone and the language used are predominantly very emotive, somewhat sensationalist. And then if you search, this kind of search also highlights the significantly high numbers of NGOs and other organisations who share concerns for children's welfare and safety. There are so many of them in Nepal. Nepal has lots of NGOs working in the rescue of orphans from commercial orphanages, but actually some of these NGOs operate as residential homes themselves. And the respondents talked about the kind of differences and similarities really between commercial orphanages and NGO rescue orphanages. So while some of these institutions mainly serve as short-term transit residencies for children rescued from profiteering orphanages, and these are rescue operations that often happen with the assistance from police or other state agencies, some children end up getting stuck in these longer-term NGO residencies. And I argue that although NGO homes generally offer significantly safer, more enriching environments than commercial orphanages, they can still be problematic because they expose children to foreign volunteers, and in doing so they risk reproducing some of the issues associated with orphanage tourism. An orphanage, oh sorry, yeah, so I'll just, I think, I'll move on. So as well as being interested in the entry routes then into commercial orphanages and how, you know, how children experienced life in orphanages compared to, you know, prior to leaving their villages, one of my main research questions was to find out how the children had exited orphanage tourism. So what happens when they're not children anymore, and how this had affected them. So this can involve either sort of just aging out, so either being kicked out of commercial orphanages because their age makes them undesirable to tourists, or aged out of NGO care because they've turned 18. And for, as I've said, for 20 of my participants, it also involved some form of NGO rescue and rehoming by NGOs. And it's clear from their accounts that this is a very fraught and stressful and can be quite a traumatizing process. Rescue raids usually happen in the middle of the night, and that in itself can be obviously terrifying and confusing. Children are then, as I've said, usually placed in some kind of transit care, and then often they're rehomed, so they're taken back to their families in Umla. And this again can be extremely destabilizing and confusing, and not really what the child wants, you know, to just be suddenly put back into your estranged family in a remote mountainous village, into a culture and lifestyle that you no longer recognize, and without the friends that you've been growing up with, and so on. And so BJ and Birendra described these feelings. BJ said, yes, we didn't understand their language. This was after they'd been taken back to their villages. We didn't understand their language, and they didn't understand our language, and they used to sometimes call us dumb. Later we got used to it, and then we know how to speak the language. When I first went back home after 8 or 9 years, I didn't recognize my mother, but I knew how my father was as he had come to meet me. And then Birendra, same thing with me, but I didn't recognize my father and sisters, as we used to only talk over the phone, and I was confused. My siblings are studying in Kathmandu and staying with an uncle. And this was Pragati, who was sent to a boarding school after being rescued. He says there was an incident by which he meant a nighttime raid and rescue during our time in the boarding school, which resulted in us being sent to Umla, to a place called Yalbang, and kept in a school there. When we were there, we felt that we were kept in more severe conditions as compared to how we were in Kathmandu. We were not able to assimilate to the environment there. This resulted in us running away from the school there. According to my personal experience, this was probably the worst struggle that I had to endure when I was in Yalbang in Umla. It felt like a jail. It was a routine, and everything depended on the sound of the bell. You woke up in the morning to the sound of the bell. We didn't know how to speak the Lama language, and yet we had to pray in the Lama language. So a real sense of kind of cultural dislocation there upon being rescued. And then this process of aging out of NGO care was also equally difficult. The participants talked about, you know, a range of problems in relation to their exit, feeling very sad and regretful and afraid and disoriented, and some of them were really angry. They missed what they described as their brothers and sisters, and they felt lost, without purpose and alone. Some experienced strong feelings of rejection during their teenage years and began resembling an adult. So, for example, Kanak, who was rescued from a commercial orphanage during a raid, again put in NGO care, where he experienced a few relatively settled years. This is what he terms his dark heaven, because on turning 18, Kanak was aged out of the system and released. This was by an NGO, or, you know, he terms it being disowned. He felt entirely unequipped to face an independent life as an adult in Kathmandu. He had poor health, very little money, and no home. He felt disoriented and abandoned. And he told me that we are a product for volunteers, but volunteers do not know how we are feeling. Children learn most from being with their parents. They learn what is good and bad. They get guidance. Children have more fun in the orphanage, but now I regret not knowing my culture. I do not know my festivals and religion. I know everyone else's religion, but not my own. And he talks about his adjustment problems. We don't know our parents, our grandparents. The NGO took me from an orphanage, but did not help me with adjusting to the world, which is different after the Civil War. They don't teach you skills, so you become a man and you are nothing. So I think then we can see from Kanak that the currency of childhood and specifically orphanhood disappears on coming of age, and this causes or exacerbates many of the problems and issues faced by young people exiting care. And I think that the various interventions, whether for labour exploitation by for-profit orphanage owners or rescue by NGOs, these interventions just disappear and the support disappears and the youngsters are left to fend themselves. And as we can see, thanks Julia, lots of them are irreparably estranged from their family, have emotional problems, including this dislocation, and are vulnerable to alcoholism, drug abuse, street gangs, and so on. And this is where the kind of sense of worthlessness can set in. So yeah, conclusions then, just to sum up. So I argue, and I've got so much more data that I could share if I had longer, but just to sum up then on these areas that I focused on in the talk. So I argue that the dominant discourses surrounding orphanage tourism are really failing to connect with critical tourism studies, debates, which recognise how capitalism, consumerism, globalisation, neoliberalism, all these forces that manifest in international tourism and serve to widen wealth gaps and therefore intensify the need or desire for children to migrate for work. I think that the ways in which orphanage tourism is being framed mainly serves the interests of those who make a living out of the eradication campaign and the rescue industry. And I talk in my analysis about the huge international NGO presence in Kathmandu and how their presence undermines the work of local organisations working at grassroots levels to protect children from harm, to keep children in education. And these organisations, these INGOs, often compete with local NGOs for funding and contribute to a kind of civil society imperialism that really blights many global South countries. And I think also that the preoccupation with trafficking that allows these campaigns to get funding and to gain prominence really diminishes the central role of tourism markets and the role of volunteers themselves, whose consumption feeds demand for placements in orphanages. Because while orphanages have mostly become a thing of the past in the West, the third world orphan is still constructed as a worthy cause for lay humanitarianism. And this is in tension with the concurrent drive to rescue and rehome children and abolish orphanage tourism altogether. And the question that we're left with is, where does this leave children and families with poor alternatives or no alternatives? And meanwhile, the notions of globalized childhood in the era of child rights underpin the quest to eradicate orphanage tourism in recent anti-slavery and anti-trafficking agendas. Again, though, whose discourse falls short of considering the complexities of the lives in question and falls short in respecting the views of those it constructs as victims. It seems that the orphan figure evokes an especially emphasised form of childhood vulnerability, which I think fits with what Murphy calls the sensationalist misinformation presented in modern slavery rhetoric. In this way, I argue the orphan represents the ideal victim, a construction that's fed back into social perception and ultimately into the development of legal and policy frameworks. I think that this notion of orphanhood is exploited, yes, of course, by fraudulent orphanage owners and arguably by NGOs and charities desperate to secure funding, but also increasingly by academics whose work fits with the abolitionists' goals of these kind of high profile, often very lucrative eradication campaigns. And that's it, thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, if only we could give you a round of applause, we would. That's it. Again, we've gone to 30 minutes, so I'm going to suggest that we move straight on to Sam and then have Q&A for everybody afterwards. So without further ado, over to Dr. Sam Chire, who's a sociologist at the University of Bristol, and whose research focuses on childhood rights, globalization, migration, and in particular who has developed a critique of dominant discourse on child labour as modern slavery. And today he's going to talk about his work on NGO interventions into children's mobility in Ghana. So over to you, Sam.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Initially, I wasn't going to use any PowerPoint slides, but I've had to bow to peer pressure and cobble together something very quickly while Esther was presenting. So I will share that screen now and pick it up from there. Okay, so my presentation brings into focus the problems, as Julia said, associated with anti-child trafficking raids and specifically how these raids that are carried out in the Ghanaian context by the anti-trafficking unit of the Ghana Police Service in partnership with the NGO, the International Justice Mission, IJM, abuse the rights and freedoms of indigenous and marginalized communities in the country in quite spectacular ways. And I draw on research carried out in remote islands and riverine communities which have been subjected to such anti-trafficking raids over the last decade or so to exemplify this concern. So the starting point for this project was in 2017 when the Member of Parliament for the Afram Plains North constituency of Ghana issued a press release and a statement on the floor of the Parliament of Ghana calling for the Speaker's intervention and Parliament's intervention in what she described as the abduction and illegal detention of approximately 144 children from constituencies in communities in their constituency rather. The MP was referring to an incident a few weeks earlier when the Ghana Police Service Anti-Trafficking Unit and the IJM had raided several communities in her constituency, and in her words and those of the community members, snatched children from boats on the Lake Volta under the suspicion that these children were victims of child trafficking or child slavery. Now, for those who are unaware of the IJM, it's a US-based, self-described Christian evangelical Christian organization founded in 1997. And I read some of this information from its website. It's mainly focused on eliminating or abolishing human trafficking, forced prostitution, forced labor, and other activities classed as or popularly presented as modern slavery. Now, so in other words, the IJM has positioned itself or positions itself, as many others have done today, as an organization that is continuing the tradition of the 19th century slavery abolitionist movement by freeing those who are described as modern slaves or slaves of our time, or other people facing other forms of oppression. And they usually work by sending out operatives into spaces or communities where they believe that trafficking or other forms of modern slavery are occurring. This can also be volunteers sometimes to carry out their own covert observations or investigations. And then they believing that they have found the activity of which they suspected happening, and they partner with local law enforcement officials to raid these spaces and rescue those they deem to be victims and arrest those they deem to be perpetrators. Now, much of its work takes place in the global south, where, as numerous scholars have critically observed, in modern slavery discourses, an assumption is held that, you know, these are areas of the world where somehow people are not yet sufficiently developed or civilized or human rights institutions aren't sufficiently well developed, and therefore modern slavery is still, or slavery still is endemic. And it's within this context, therefore, that in 2010, the IJM set up an office in Ghana to partner with the Ghanaian government and local law enforcement to address the issue of child trafficking, which had also emerged as a matter of concern in child rights debates in the country. So this is the broad context in which the IJM became involved in work in Ghana, in partnership primarily with the anti-trafficking police unit of the anti-trafficking unit of the Ghana Police Service, and therefore carried out these raids in 2017. So I encountered these news reports, and my research area primarily over the last decade has been on issues of children's precarious labor, but I was very interested also in constructions of freedom and on freedom and the sorts of modalities that are being implemented to address problematic aspects of children's work. So we decided, myself and a couple of others, to investigate this issue to understand the complexities and the dynamics surrounding the rescue operations, as the IJM classes it, or the raids as the communities and the MP see it, but also how because one of the most, I think, salient or kind of a major issue observed here was the loud silence of the voices of these communities themselves. So there are, if you search for children's work on the Volta Lake, you will literally be drowned in information by NGOs and the media and others on children's work on these islands, but very little has been said or is known about these issues from the viewpoint of the islanders themselves. And so I was quite interested in exploring these issues from the islanders' viewpoints. And so from that, with that interest in 2018, we carried out studies among studies on 4 islands, residents of 4 of the islands in question, names provided there on the screen, to better understand the circumstances under which the children were working or children work on these islands, the circumstances under which they were taken by the police and the NGO, and the islanders' own perspectives on these issues. We employed qualitative interviews, focus group discussions, community meetings, and other methods to gather data. For time purposes, I'm going to skip over the methods and focus more on the key issues that we found. So primary point which came out through this study is, first of all, moral panics and pejorative assumptions about the islanders and their traditions. If you explore the literature and the sorts of discourses which are used to justify these raids, it's often said that the islanders are, they are typically portrayed as a bunch of heartless, backwards and primitive types who have no qualms whatever about trafficking children from parts of Ghana to these islanders to then enslave them or put them to work in the fishing, cottage fishing industry on these islands. So we found, paradoxically, despite the kind of claims of this nature made, the IJM, the police, and no other anti-trafficking organization for that matter actually has a presence on these islands at all. These are really remote islands, and it was very difficult accessing them ourselves. So without in-depth understanding of children's upbringing, but also how children from other parts of the country end up on these islands, one who doesn't live there can easily mistake these children to be victims of trafficking or children who have been brought there. The reality is that these islands in the early 1960s, when Ghana had newly become independent, the country wanted to create a dam to power, to provide energy. And so people living on the Volta Lake or in the Volta estuary at the time were asked to relocate to different parts of the country. Some people did, and they moved to places such as Winneba and Cape Coast and elsewhere. Others remained. Now, these spaces were flooded, and for a while they were uninhabitable. But gradually islands emerged, and so people who had moved from these islands started moving back, and they therefore maintained connections with the places where they had relocated. And as a result, there is a lot of movement between these places where families, and other people move, and so on and so forth. And one needs to engage with the islanders to understand these interconnections, first of all. But also, these are islands, and so it is quite rare to find a child who doesn't somehow engage with the lake in some way, shape, or form. The lake is the marketplace, it's the playground, it's pretty much everything. And also, because they are islands, there are three main activities in which one could be involved. There are three main job prospects there: fishing, farming, or charcoal burning. And so most families deem it really important that their children are taught how to fish or how to work on the lake. Indeed, if you don't know how to work on the lake, you are unlikely to succeed or to be able to fend for yourself. And therefore, it's really very hard to find a child on the island who at some point wouldn't be introduced to farm. But as I say, these dynamics are really hard to understand if you don't live on the island, if you don't engage with the islanders, and instead if you sort of send in people to spy on them to see whether children are simply on the lake in boats and take that as evidence of child trafficking. The other bit then is about normative assumptions about childhood and child upbringing, because in sort of mainstream child rights and childhood discourse, the fact of a child being involved in fishing is deemed as a form of child abuse or a violation of a child's rights. Typically, it's assumed that the only place where a child can be properly developed is in the classroom or formal education, which, by the way, isn't accessible to many of the islanders because there are no schools on most of these islands anyway. And so the fishing activity is key to the child's upbringing or their education, or providing them, as the islanders see it, with the skills that will stand them in good stead for the future. My PhD, as I said, will be of no use whatsoever if I lived on the island and I didn't know how to fish. So all of these complexities are part of the picture. But as I say, there are, in mainstream child rights discourses, there is a position that a child who is not being educated is having their rights deprived them or having their rights violated. And this is really central to the modalities of the IJM. So it doesn't matter, and for the police as well, it doesn't matter that a child can be in school but also being taught how to fish. The very fact of the child being on the lake is taken as prima facie evidence of the crime being committed. The other thing is about the violence of rescue, because again, we hear very often that a child has been rescued. Very little is said about the violence associated with this act. And one case actually stays with me till present after the field work. There was a 70-year-old man who was fishing with his grandchild who, the way the rescue operation occurs, the police armed with guns and speedboats swoop very quickly onto these canoes that are operated by the fishermen and their children, and screaming and shouting at them, bring the child, bring the child. So some of the children in fear cling onto their parents or their siblings, and this grandson was clinging onto his grandfather. They were both grabbed from their boat and flung onto that of the police. The 70-year-old man broke several of his ribs. They were taken to a larger boat commandeered by the IJM, And according to the 70-year-old man, the white man who was the kind of IJM operative directing the operations, told the police to send him back to the lakeshore. No medical attention, nothing. They just sent this man back, and he was still unwell at the time of the field work. But the third element which came out very strongly in our research was about the politics, as we call it, of child rights and international development broadly, because much of this activity, much of this problem occurs or is rooted in international humanitarian and rights discourses. Over the last 2 decades, discourse on modern slavery and child trafficking and child labor has emerged at the international level, and this is the driving sort of force or driving factor for the IJM and its operatives, among other organizations that are also working in the modern slavery or child trafficking abolitionist field. Ghana itself came up in the USA's Trafficking in Persons report as a country where child trafficking is endemic. And these reports are usually presented or created by anti-trafficking NGOs for their own advocacy. So the IJM itself does its own research to prove its belief in in the existence of child trafficking. These reports make it onto the US Trafficking in Persons report, and it's like almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that the country can be warned, as Ghana was by the then UN in 2017 US ambassador to Ghana, warned that it risked losing approximately $700 million in aid if it did not do much more to address the issues of child trafficking that had been identified. So on the Trafficking in Persons report, Ghana was placed on a tier 2 watch list as a country not doing enough to address trafficking, and warned that unless it does more, if it fell further on the ranking, then it would lose that much money. Now, for a country which is not even able to raise enough to pay its civil service, you can imagine how this threat would go down. So Ghana and poor countries such as Ghana are therefore compelled, in a sense, to play ball with organizations such as the IJM, which are very well funded, very well connected. IJM, I think, benefits from US government funding to the tune of several millions of dollars a year. It's an organization worth over $60 million, so very, very rich and influential. And unless the Ghanaian government allows its police service to accompany the IJM on raids, it can be reported as not doing enough to address child trafficking in its borders. So my argument is that the IJM and anti-trafficking organizations operating in the global south or in poor countries such as Ghana are empowered in ways that enable them to not only commandeer units of the police service, but also direct other aspects of people's lives. They are positioned with such influence and control that makes them able to act in ways which I think are really quite disturbing. So if you contrast this with the communities which were raided, many islanders hadn't even seen a police officer before. The first time they got a police presence on their islands was when they came to raid their communities and take their children away. Crimes that occur there go, uninvestigated. There isn't much provided for them in terms of social services, social welfare provisions or infrastructure. Basically, these islands have been marginalized and cut away from much of the national development, no electricity, and so on and so forth. And at the same time as their children were rescued for being on the lake, some of the parents were told that their crime was not taken for failing to take their children to school. And the paradox, I said, is that there aren't schools on the islands anyway. So in a sense, you've got the government or the police service, which is the government, which is itself part of the problem in that it has failed to provide its citizens with the basic needs of education and so on and so forth, acting in tandem with an organization which vehemently believes in the backwardness or the sort of the problem as it sees it of child trafficking on these islands. And you've got on the other hand the islanders who are caught at the mercy of these two actors in the raids. So to conclude, then, I argue that the IJM's practices and the raids and rescue operations, as they call it, another rhetoric through which it presents itself as an emancipator or agent of benevolence or freedom, hides the fact that it's also an agent of oppression and unfreedom. And a part of the problem here is that sometimes actors which believe in the rightness of their actions can also find it really hard to believe that or to accept that they can also produce gross inhuman human rights violations too. And as Govind and others have argued elsewhere, through the theater of raid and rescue, the IJM's operations and the vision of liberation that it promotes, I think, has significant implications for how we think about the political and ethical dimensions of human and child rights and anti-trafficking or humanitarian interventions, by drawing on commonly held assumptions about the nature of slavery and freedom, or of child rights and childhood violations. The IJM is able to suture the concerns about one may ordinarily have had about the kind of serious harms which we discovered through our research, and instead flatten, or really make it hard for most people to understand what is a complex issue, and therefore accept the raids as somehow the only possible solution to the problem. I will stop here so we can have a bit of time for the discussion. Thank you very much for your time.